Hello, hello! We are back for week 4 of our light and depth series. Today we're going to need just a few brushes. We're going to need our trusty old wash brush. And then if you could find a number 6 or a number 8 round brush that comes to a point, that would be awesome. I think mine's a number 6. Yeah, that's my favorite brush. And then your favorite detail brush. I have a teeny tiny one for today, but if you don't have a teeny tiny one, don't worry, just make sure it's pretty small. And then lastly, if you have a kind of bristly brush like that creates really cool texture on a page, grab that, or any larger, fluffier brush will do. So here's our Payne's Gray, and then we're going to be working with our Burnt Sienna. All right, and then I have this Daniel Smith red. It's more like a scarlet, but a cadmium red is perfect. And then our yellow ochre. And lastly, our Prussian blue. Okay, so I'll show you. I've got about this much paint, a dot of each. All right, and we're going to be working with also our favorite little spray bottle or atomizer. I've learned recently that you can call them an atomizer. And so what we're going to do first is spray our page down. Not super soaking wet, so you'll see I'm going to go over probably a couple of times. But first, before I do that, let me show you this beautiful picture. It's kind of our picture of what we're going to be working on today. And here we go. We're atomizing. We're spraying. Ooh, I got a little schmutz on there. So you can see I'm not like going crazy with the water, just getting it damp, if that makes sense. So we're going to take our wash brush and just work that water into the page, being mindful of the edges and the corners. And this is a little different today. We're going to be doing a little wet on wet, and then we'll be doing wet paint on dry paper. So it's a little mix today of techniques, but what we're going to work with first is our yellow ochre. And I want you to get it to a nice, I would say 50-50 consistency. And just start spreading it around the page. Now that actually looks a little more like 25 or 75% water, 25% color to me. So I'll probably go back in and darken it up a little bit in just a second. All right, here we go. And what we're going to do is we're just creating some of the golden light that's going to shine through the background of our picture. So vertical stripes at first, okay? And then I'm going to start working at an angle, you can see here. So these are going to be kind of like our sun rays, okay? And don't forget to put them up top because we are going to see peaks of golden through the canopy. All right. So that's how we're working today. We're working with some sunbeams, some vertical downward beams, some diagonal. Just we want a healthy glow to the picture. Okay, I'm just going back in and touching up a little bit of the yellow where I feel like it could be a little bolder. Because remember, this will dry down a lot lighter than you think it will. So just if you feel like it looks a little pale, go ahead and add a touch more color if you feel like it's necessary. Okay, we're working in there. Now, I'm going to spritz it just a tiny bit, just a little bit, okay? Just to make sure it's still kind of juicy so our paint will diffuse like it's supposed to. And what we're going to do now is take the Payne's Gray and make a very similar mixture, 50-50 if we can get it there, but it's really dark, so you see how light that is? All right, I'm going to start off with 75-25, 75% water, 25% paint, and then I'm just going to build it if I feel like I need to. Yep, there we go. That's more of the color you want. You want a little bit more, and so what this is going to do for us for the background is create shadow. So in between the stripes of sunlight, I would like for you to create little stripes of shadow, okay? And don't worry if your page is starting to get dry a little bit. Remember, if it's still damp, you can go back with a spritzer and it'll fix it. No big deal. All right, so you can see I've got a little warping going on, but that's because I'm actually working on the back of another painting, just a scrap painting that I was practicing with. So you don't necessarily want your paper warping at this point, but mine's already warped, so it is what it is. But go ahead and add some of that shadow up to the top of your painting too, just focused in the corners, because that's going to be the tip tops of our canopy. And there'll be some shadow there. So go ahead, and if you feel like you need a little bit more gold somewhere, like I do with this little sun ray here, it's just, next to this gray, feels like it's a little pale, go ahead and add too. There you go. All right. And while we're doing this, you just want to be starting to think about where we're going to be placing the larger bunches of leaves in the tops of the trees, which are going to be those two right and left corners up top. So don't worry if you see something in the top right or left corner that you don't love, you're about to cover it up. Don't worry about it. Okay, we're building this gray. All right, spritz that a little bit because it's a tiny bit dry, but you can see now when you've got it to about where you want it, if you tip it, it'll move around, get soft, look more like diffused light through trees. Okay, and don't worry if you get a little dry spot like that, just take your brush, move it around a little bit. Tell that paint what to do because you are the boss. All right, here we go. Okay, just touch that up a little bit. Okay, perfect. So this next part takes a little bit of finessing. I'm hitting this with a dryer for like 30 seconds, 35 seconds maybe. I'm not trying to dry the picture entirely. I'm just trying to get the puddly bits a little more dry. Still want it to be a little bit damp on the paper because we are going to now be working on the background leaves of the canopy of the trees. So you can see there I'm trying to work out that little bit of extra wetness. And then if it's still super wet but you don't want it and it's starting to dry everything around it, take a paper towel and just dab it, and then it'll add some texture. No big deal. All right, so we're still damp, which is great. That's where we want it to be. Now here comes my favorite part. So I want you to take that big brush, the biggest fluffiest brush you have, and I don't want you to wet it. I want you to take some of that raw paint, okay, and just smush it around, and just start dabbing it onto your page. We're going to start with the yellow ochre first, because what that is the very tops of the tree where the sunlight hits first, right? And then we're going to fade it down with this burnt sienna. I'm going to make it a little darker. And again, just get some good, work that paint into the brush, okay? Right, and then we're just going to start working that into the ochre just to give it a little more depth, a little more color. And then we're going to work in some of this red. Now this is, like I said, this is like a scarlet, almost like a blood red, but a red cadmium will do just fine. So if you don't have this particular color, go ahead and use that cadmium red. Okay, and then I'm going to take some Payne's Gray. Now I'm going to add a tiny bit of water here because this will look straight up black if we don't. And you can see where the page is still pretty damp, and so it's not going on. The black, the further down we work on this page, because it's not super dry, it's going to start to diffuse a little bit, which is totally fine. We want lots and lots of texture. So keep working that in there. And now we're going to take our spritzer, our little atomizer, and just give it 1 or 2 sprays. That's it. A little further away. We don't want it super close up. And all we're doing, as you can see, is we're just moving some things down the board. We don't want it to completely obscure all the detail we put in, but we do want it to soften a little bit. So go ahead and do that. And I would suggest just tilting it to that one side. I wouldn't like take it all around the page, because that's not necessarily what we want to do. So here we are, and this bottom edge, to me, needs just a touch more texture and maybe a little more paint. So we're going to go in and just kind of move some of this Payne's Gray around as well. So you can take, a dry brush and wet paint and pick up that paint, move it around the page if you like. Bring that branch out a little bit here. Like I said, we don't want to completely take away all the texture we just made. So there we go. And like I said, you can always go back in and add more paint. I'm adding a little more Payne's Gray in here just because I feel like it washed out a little too much. So again, just work with the water on the page. Don't work against it. If it's a little wet, go ahead and put some thicker paint in there and it will show up better. Okay, we're going to bring this down. Again, creating more branches, more leaves. Okay, and so next we're going to do the exact same thing to the other side. It doesn't have to look exactly the same, of course, because trees are all different. So similar, but not twins, but sisters. We'll say these trees are not twins, they're sisters. So you're going to use some of the same colors, but create different shapes. Feel free to create different shapes. So this is what I'm doing. Going back in with that yellow ochre first. And I want the sunlight to come a little further down on this one and hit it a little further down in this tree. So that ochre came down a little further. All right, next we're going to go in with that beautiful burnt sienna. Oh, yes. Those look really nice together. Okay, we'll bring that up here. And then we're going to work in some of this red. Okay. Oh, I love that color. So again, see, like I said, you're getting these wonderful textures that mimic tree leaves a lot easier than going in and trying to paint things hand by hand, or piece by piece. It's a nice little way to cheat that. So we've created texture. You could also use a sponge if you really wanted to. That's another way of doing it. But we're going to bring these branches down a little lower on this tree. And I want to do something really quickly. I'll show you what I'm going to do. I put at the top of those shadows that we created earlier, I put a little bit of that black paint. Okay. Now I'm going to take my wash brush and I'm going to pull that paint down with a wet wash brush to make that shadow a little bit deeper. I just want it to be a little more exaggerated. Okay. All right. See, now we've got some exaggerated light and shadow. And so now we're going to do the same thing with our spray bottle. We're just going to spritz it a couple times just to be safe. Okay, we don't want to completely destroy all of the color we did. So we just want to move it around a little bit and use your brush to move stuff around like we did before. Get that Payne's Gray moving around. All right, we're going to soften up some of these edges. All right, and just let it tilt to that one side and let that paint drain down and just move some of that paint around with your brush if you need to. There we go. And we're connecting some of these pieces too. All right. Oh, that looks really good to me. All right, so we're going to do one more spritz here to get that little black spot moving. There we go. And really happy with that. Let's see. Oh, yes. We like it on the move. Okay. And make sure, be better than I am about wiping the paint off the tape because it saves a mess. Sometimes I'll just let it be a mess and then I'm like, why do I have paint all over my clothing and my hands and my body? Well, because I am a messy painter and I don't clean up after myself. So make sure to wipe the tape down. Save yourself the heartache. All right, and I'm going to soften up the edges on these shadows just a touch. So what I'm going to do is I've sprayed it a little bit, and you can do one of two things. You can go in with a clean wet brush and just kind of dab. There you go. Soften that edge up a little bit. We'd love to see it. All right. Now, I actually think I want a little bit more gold in here. Okay, so there we go. And again, this is still wet on wet, so it's got a lot of freedom to move. So just be mindful of that when you're doing this. If you go back in to color correct something, and it's like wet on wet, you're going to have to pay real close attention. But you can do that, see, as I did You could add more if you want that to be a brighter golden ray of sunshine. All right, and then we're just diffusing this up here, creating more little branches, little pieces and bits of texture, which are going to be important for later, because again, this is light and depth, so we're going to be creating trees further back in the distance with a lighter touch of paint, thinner paint, more water, you'll see. But what we want to do now is create that foreground. A lot of interesting looking variations. So here we are. And if you feel like, oh, there we go. Got to get that moving a little bit. So if you feel like it's still looking a little flat, just do what I did and just keep moving it around. See what happens. I'm super happy with this. I'm pleased. Okay. So, little thing though, it's just a little bugaboo for me. I'm going to spray this edge of this shadow because it's still a little harsh in my opinion. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did before and just kind of dab it out a little bit. Okay, that's doing much better. That makes me happy. And then if there's too much water, just go ahead and go in with your paper towel and pick it up. And also that will help with the softening of a hard line in your painting. Okay, so use the tools you have on hand. They're great. Paper towels are a lifesaver. Okay, I'm super duper happy with this. I think I'm pretty pleased. So what we're going to do now, of course, is pull out our hair dryers and go ahead and dry this completely this time. We did we left it damp the first time. I want it completely dry this time. So go ahead and do that. And this next part is going to be super, super fun. Okay, now that our page is completely dry, I want you to go ahead and grab your number 6 or number 8 round brush and get that ready, because what we're going to do now is paint the tree trunks. So grab your brush, and again, it's important that this comes to a point because we're going to use that point for details and scrubbing and things like that. So go ahead and grab your paint, and what we're going to do is mix our Prussian blue. Okay, see that really pretty Prussian blue with some of this Payne's gray, and what you want is a more muted gray blue. It's more gray than blue, so if you're curious. And we're going to start out with more of a 50-50 mix. This is still going to be a pretty watery mix, but you want it pretty dark because what we're going to start working on is our foreground trees. And so the first tree I'm going to work on is right here beside this. You can see where there's a yellow sun ray, and then there's like clear white, so like the brightest part of the page. I'm just a little bit off from the brightest part of the page in the yellow. Okay, so I'm gonna keep this pretty wet moving up, okay? Because the cool thing about working wet on dry is that you can put wet paint down and then add more water to the stroke you just put down and pull that paint up, and the further up it goes, the lighter it gets. So it's kind of that ombre effect. So, but again, this is our foreground tree, so it's going to be a little bit darker than some of the other trees that we're going to do later. Here we go. We're going to go all the way up to the top of the canopy. And so here we are. And what we're doing is now we're going to start working on basically the foreground leaves. After we get our trunk where we want it, if we're happy with that, I want you to take some more of the paint that you just used for the trunk and water it down a tiny bit more, and then just start moving your brush around the page. It's nothing, there's no rhyme or reason really. It's just kind of like, oh, this looks like a nice dot here. Go ahead and grab some more of that yellow ochre or the burnt sienna, and we're just going to kind of mimic the colors in the background, but we're going to be using the wet on dry paper technique, so it's going to be a little more stand out from the rest, okay? Because that's what we're seeing as we're walking into the forest. Those are going to be the leaves that appear closest to us. So we want to give them a little more definition. So keep working that way through the leaves in this particular tree. Like I said, we want to keep it similar to what's in the background. Doesn't have to be exactly the same. Could be a little darker. More of the dark blues and Payne's gray is totally fine because it is kind of like, the underside of the trees that we're seeing first. But make sure to do include some of that yellow and orange and red. So you'll see I'm just working through with, again, not a ton of water because I don't want to disturb the paint underneath very much. And even if you do, guess what? It adds more texture. It's not it really is, it doesn't matter. You'll see what I plan on doing later is getting through some of these and then going back and spritzing it a little bit and taking my paper towel and dabbing up some of the paint so it does look a little more texturized, a little more forward versus the really smooth, soft background. So now that I've built in most of the foreground leaves, I'm going to go in and just take a damp, you can either spray it first or you can actually take a damp cloth like I have here, and I'm just kind of dabbing up some of the paint just to give it a little extra oomph and not so kind of like color blocked, if you know what I mean. We've got a little variegation happening. Feels a little more dreamy, which is what this picture really is supposed to feel like. And like you can see, I'm going to soften up these edges like I did before with the spray bottle, but just a damp cloth at this point. And again, it just creates so much more interest in the picture. All right, so now that we've done that one, we're going to move over to the darker. So this is a foreground tree, but then we're going to have one more. It's a little darker, but actually first let me fill in this color a little bit. So if you see that you don't love like all of the color being taken up in a certain spot, go ahead and add it back. It's not a big deal. Of course, we know that you can build on watercolors. They just build up. So go ahead and just reassess. Make sure you're loving what you're seeing. If you don't, take a moment to go ahead and fill in any spots that you think may need a little attention. Okay, so now that we've reassessed our tree foliage, I'm super happy with mine, so I'm going to move on. I'm actually going to start on a softer tree a little further behind the tree we just painted. I was going to do the dark one next, but I want to see where I need to put my softer trees first. So I'm going to come in here. So if that first mix was about 50-50, I would say this is 60% water, 40% paint. And again, it's in shadow, so you see that dark gray that it's sitting behind? We want it to look lighter because it is covered up a little more. Now what's cool is you can see that some of it is in the gold light, and so whatever's in the gold light, I'm going to make a little bit darker, which is really fun. Again, one of those things about painting in shadow and light is the challenge of trying to figure out exactly how dark you should make something and in what variation of light it sits in. You'll see once we move to the right side of the page, we have some deeper shadows and contrast with the yellow right next to it. What we're going to do there, the techniques we'll use in that. But for right now, we do know, because we've been studying depth in this class, that typically things in the foreground are going to be darker and things in the background are going to be lighter. So that's the same principle we're working on right now. Also, if you ever need to, you can always go back and darken up that foreground tree if you need to. It's not gonna really mess up what you're doing. Okay, so I'm really happy with that one. All right. So here we go. This is the really dark one. This is where I'm gonna be moving. And this, I love this one. It's gonna be so fun. This is gonna shoot right up through that shadow and through the sunlight. So we're about to really have some fun playing with the opacity of paint. So you can see it's pretty darn dark. And again, we're still working on that. Oh, and I didn't tell if I didn't mention it before. I don't remember if I did, but that's a mix of like the gray, the Payne's gray, and the Prussian blue again. So same thing. All right, and so I've gotten to right at the tip of that shadow, and the paint on my page is still pretty wet, so it's still very movable. And I'm just going to thicken up this tree trunk. Since it is in the foreground, it's going to be a little bit thicker. All right. And so like I said before, when you're moving up the page and you just keep going with your paint, you can create an ombre effect by just letting the paint go where it wants to. Now when it's this dark though, and we're trying to mimic a shadow, get a little more clean water on your brush and just get the very tip of that. And do you see the variation in color? Oh, it's so fun. Yay. Okay, now let's create our little branches here. Where do we want it to go? This is a particularly tall tree, right? I want another branch going through the sunlight again. Okay, so here we go. Now you see where it's like nice and dark, and then there's that shadow. Now where the sunlight's hitting it, that yellow beam of sunshine, we're going to darken it back up because you can see it more clearly because it's lit up. So again, go back in, nice wet paint, okay, and just move things around. It's really not as difficult as it looks. I know sometimes we can get intimidated by things we see on paper, but once you know the technique and you practice, it gets easier and easier. Okay, we're going to pull some of this paint down. There we go. Here we are. So now you can clearly see the difference in the shades of the bark of the tree because a part of it's in the shadow and most of it's in sunlight. There we go. And if you want a more stark contrast, and I think I want a little bit more of a stark contrast, just go ahead and add some more paint in there. And you don't have to add much because again, this is your paint is still pretty wet and watery, so you can just add tiny little dots at a time, pull them down. If you don't like it, take your brush and just pick it up and dry it off on your paper towel. Easy peasy. All right. Ooh, I love how this is turning out. Okay. So again, we've created a nice dark tree trunk because it is in the foreground. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the same color that I just used to make these tree trunks, and I'm going to water it down a little bit, and I'm going to start creating, again, like I did on the other side, some leaves and some more distinct looking foliage. Okay, time for another tree in the background, and this one's going to be really, really light, and it's also going to go through the shadow and through the sunshine again. So it's the same principle with just less paint that we used on the dark tree that we just did. So again, here we go. Further back in the background, it's light. So what I typically like to do here, if I'm happy with the color of the paint that I'm working with now, I'll just drag it up through that once I've gotten some clean water on my brush. Okay, here we go. So I just darken it up a tiny bit because what we're going to do is just drag it. And again, this is what's great about working with wet paint on dry paper is you can manipulate the shades of your paint a lot easier. So as you can see, I just took that clean wet brush through that tree, through that shadow, and now it's going into the sunlight. Okay, I'm going to darken this up just a touch. to give more, like I said, differentiation between light and shadow. Okay, and there goes tree branch. There we go. And again, it's a little darker, you can see, than what's behind the shadow. And what's cool is at this point, I'm going to start doing what I did before with the foreground leaves, but just with the paint that I have on my brush, and creating some more distinct leaves, but they're, again, softer because they're in the background. Okay, see, I love that. Oh, it looks so good. I love painting with light and shadow. It's really neat. Okay. I think now we're going to work with another tree or two. So, at your discretion, in however dark or light you want to make them, why don't you go ahead and paint in a couple of more trees in the background, doing what I did right there with that light tree, that background tree, further background tree that went through the shadow and the light. And just see what you can create using those techniques we just worked on. As you're working on these background trees, don't forget that you can create, like I said, just use the paint on your brush to create more leaves. But always, as always, you can add more color, or you can take away color by, if you don't love something, like I didn't love how this tree was looking, so I just went ahead and took my paper towel and picked some things up and moved some things around, and just, like I said, easy peasy, not a big deal. I love this when we're working with wet on dry, how useful a paper towel can be. Now we're going to take our little detail brush and we're going to create some smaller saplings in the forest, and we're going to do the exact same thing we did before, minding where our shadows and sunlight lay, but we're just going to do it with a really thin brush and little tiny leaves. It's a very similar process to which we just worked on with our number 6 brush. But go ahead, and this is that Payne's Gray and Prussian Blue mix, just really, really, really watered down. Okay, so there's some more saplings in the back. And I like to add leaves to my little saplings because I'm not entirely sure what these kind of trees are, but they're beautiful and tall and elegant, and they have beautiful foliage. So I didn't want them to look like dead little saplings in the woods, because sometimes they don't make it, poor things. If you've ever taken a walk through the woods and you've seen like the dried up saplings that didn't make it, it's kind of sad. But these are not those. These saplings have foliage on them. So I'm going to go back after I finish creating the structure of the tree. You'll see I'm going to go back in and just create a few little leaves here and there with my brush, just like we did before. It's just kind of a scrubbing technique. We're just kind of making marks on the page, not necessarily looking for perfection. And there you have it. We have a beautiful forest scape with gorgeous depth and light, and it's just dreamy. Thank you guys for sitting with me today and painting, and I really appreciate the time that we've spent together doing this. So happy painting, and I'm excited to see what you guys come up with. See you, bye.